We are standing in what's called museum storage at the Kentucky Historical Society. You're looking at about 100,000 pieces in this room that are all contained in boxes or cabinets, and everything has a location, everything has a space so we can find it again. The scope of things are all the way from prehistory all the way up to the present. So the Historical Society collects pretty much anything that has something to do with Kentucky history. It doesn't matter what time period it is. It doesn't matter what size it is. We just have to be able to care for it properly. We look for things that tell stories, and that's really what the Kentucky Historical Society collects. We collect things, but we want them to tell stories about Kentuckians from the past so that Kentuckians from the present can learn about them. So it's fine if somebody brings in a set of their grandmother's china, and that's great. It was used in Kentucky. But what we're really interested in is, what's the story behind that? How was that china used? Where did they get it? Are there stories associated? Was it the good china that only came out at Christmas? Those kind of things make those pieces come alive. Just having the piece is not enough for us. This is a pike, which is a weapon. It's actually a medieval design, designed basically to stop horsemen. And this one is significant because it was made for John Brown, the abolitionist from Kansas who launched the raid on Harper's Ferry, which really sort of brought about the Civil War in a big way. John Brown commissioned about 800 of these pikes. Only 700 some were actually made. And his idea was that he was going to raid Harper's Ferry. He was going to bring these pikes. He was going to free the slaves that were around Harper's Ferry, arm them with these pikes, and then it would start a slave revolt that would end slavery in the nation. So John Brown, an amazingly charismatic figure. You could, I think, very much debate whether he was a freedom fighter or a terrorist. His legacy is still contested to this day. He, of course, lost. His raid at Harper's Ferry was a failure. He was captured and along with some of his sons were killed, and then he was executed, and he sort of became a martyr to the Union cause once the war began. This pike in particular is really interesting because it has a real Kentucky connection, because what happened after Brown was captured was the governor of Virginia sent these pikes to governors of southern slaveholding states. So Beriah Magoffin here in Kentucky got this pike, and this pike was displayed at the old state capitol just a stone's throw from where we're standing right now, and it was seen as a symbol of what Southerners needed to do. They needed to stop abolitionists, and they needed to preserve slavery, because this is what John Brown was trying to arm their slaves with and to kill them. And so it was really this sort of very powerful, used as a powerful pro-slavery symbol, even though John Brown was anti-slavery. And it's a wonderful, wonderful piece to look at the Civil War and look at the Civil War in Kentucky. If you're thinking about the Civil War in Kentucky, one of the things you got to realize is that Kentucky was a Union state, but it was also a split state. It was very divided. You had we actually had a Union governor, and we had a Confederate governor at the same time. The Confederate governor didn't have any real power, but it shows a division in the state. And even the Union supporters here in Kentucky really thought they were fighting for the Union to preserve the Union, but they did not think that they were fighting to abolish slavery. Kentucky was reliant on slave labor. They were reliant on the slave economy. Kentucky was the bridge between the North and the South, and did very well by that. So we would ship hemp and horses and slaves down further south for plantations, and then we would ship goods from the south up to the north for industry. And so being the middleman made Kentucky a lot of money, and things were good, and Kentuckians basically wanted to keep the status quo. So when the war began, even though Kentucky had had the pike and talked about saving slavery, the decision for the legislature was to try to remain neutral, and that neutrality policy was not going to last. You can't sit on the fence when everything's crumbling around you. But that was their attempt, and in some ways what they were trying to do was they were trying to say, we're not radical like John Brown in terms of getting rid of slavery, and we're not radical like the governor of Virginia in terms of willing to go to war to preserve slavery. we want a nice middle course and we want the Union to be solid. It didn't work, but that was Kentucky's plan. This sword is a presentation sword, and it was presented by the loyal citizens of Garrard County, Kentucky, to Colonel Frank Wolford. And Frank Wolford was a Kentuckian. He was a Union soldier. He was a very effective commander, and he fought against John Hunt Morgan here in Kentucky, and John Hunt Morgan, also a Kentuckian, raiding his home state. But Frank Wolford, even though he was a Union soldier, he was wearing blue, he was objected to how the war changed. And when President Lincoln wanted to allow the enlistment of African Americans in the Union Army, Frank Wolford was very upset by that. He felt like he was fighting to preserve the Union and preserve slavery. This idea of getting rid of slavery, allowing black men to be armed, terrified him. And he gave speeches against that decision and against Lincoln, and actually resigned his commission in 1864. And so Wolford, he actually was arrested later because he was so anti-Lincoln. He felt there was tyranny, and he really sort of decided that he had been betrayed by the Union. And the citizens of Garrard County, however, after he started making these speeches, felt like he was a hero for standing up to Lincoln and standing up for slavery, and they presented him with this beautiful presentation sword. And it gives you another idea about how Kentuckians felt about this war, that they felt they were fighting for the Union and also fighting for slavery. The ironic thing about that is Kentucky had the second largest number of African American enlistments out of any state. And so enslaved Kentuckians flocked by the thousands to recruiting centers inside the state and joined the United States Colored Troops, the USCT, and they fought for their own freedom here in Kentucky, despite what people like Frank Wolford wanted them to do. So as a sword, it's very pretty. As a symbol of Kentucky's attitude toward race and slavery and the aims of the Civil War, it's a powerful symbol. So a lot of these are going to be fairly familiar to people. So this is a Union soldier that you've got down here on the bottom with a fixed bayonet. And I'm just going to slide this up, and we're going to go up to the eagle right there. And so that's the American eagle, the symbol of Union, even though what Wolford was saying was that the Union had become corrupt. And then here's the inscription from the loyal citizens of Garrard County. And the question is, what are they loyal to at that time? They're loyal to Frank Wolford. And then this is the reverse, and you can see we've got the shield with the American flag shield on the back as well. And then on the hilt of the sword, this is a pretty classic standard design, is we've got the screaming eagle head that's there as well. And then another flag description there. And then we've got garnet set in the pommel there. And then the blade also has symbols as well. So we've got cross cannons and flags. We've got US inscribed on there as well. More drums and flags up here. And then on the other side of the blade, we've got eagles as well that are up here. And then also more, it looks like a helmet, military symbols that are inscribed on the blade. So this would have been an expensive sword in 1864. This is Eleanor Churchill's dress, and this piece is from the Churchill Weavers collection. Churchill Weavers were a hand weaving company out of Berea, Kentucky, and they made all kinds of fabrics. Mostly they were famous for their baby blankets, and just about every baby that was born in Kentucky for generations was wrapped in a Churchill Weavers blanket. This piece is interesting because the Churchills, rather than just being a hand weaving company, they were experimenters, and they were always working on new fabrics. And this dress is made of what they called Fabric 100. They were looking for materials that would resist shrinkage and that would maintain color fastness in washing machines. And so Mrs. Churchill, she was not only one of the owners of the company, she also experimented on herself. So whenever they made new fabrics that they were trying to test, she'd make a dress and then she'd wear that and she'd see if it actually worked and should go into production. So this was the Fabric 100 experimental dress that she wore, trying to see if it worked. They actually worked with a company to make the yarn out of Rhode Island and spent 10 years developing this process for this fabric that's used here. So they're a really interesting company. One of the great things about them, and the reason that we love them so much, we have all of their archives. They were pack rats. They saved everything. They saved a sample of every fabric they ever even thought about putting in production. They saved samples of competitors' fabrics. They hired artists to make experimental dresses. They wove fabrics out of plastic to see if it would work. They even made the spacesuit linings for the spacesuits for the Mercury space program. So they were a little hand-weaving company out of Berea with a national reach, and they were constantly trying to improve their products, and they were just very ingenious in doing that. And I just love the fact that Mrs. Churchill would go around in experimental dresses at all times, even though she was the company owner, because she wanted to test them. The stories that we've got to tell are America stories. So you've got Kentucky stories that tie into national stories, but also you've got stories that are just human stories. So stories about Kentuckians and what they did, their businesses that I think apply to everybody.